Well, a very, very good evening, everybody. If this is your first visit to Leicester, if it's your first visit to the university, a particularly warm welcome indeed. My name's Professor Philip Baker. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Enterprise here at the University of Leicester, and it's my privilege, my honour to welcome you all, and in particular our distinguished guest speaker. You are extremely welcome, sir. Our university was founded just over a century ago by the people of Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland as a symbol of hope for the future. Through education, the citizens of this region hoped to bring about a renaissance after the devastation of the First World War, the Great War. The enlightenment of education, they felt, would not only bring people together from across the world, but would break down barriers to create a better future. That hope still inspires us at the University of Leicester to this day. And at the advent of our second century, I'm absolutely delighted that the university has been invited to partner with the British Academy in this lecture series. We're one of only 12 universities across the UK to have this distinction, and the university will be part of the National Lecture Series by way of hosting highly prestigious lectures chosen in partnership with the Academy. Our purpose in holding public lectures and in bringing to you lecturers of such distinction is to enhance knowledge, increase understanding, and stimulate discussion in a spirit of mutual respect. I'm particularly delighted to invite Professor Judith Still from the British Academy to tell us just a bit more about the Academy. Professor Judith.
Hello. So, as we've said, I'm Judith Still, Emeritus Professor of French and Critical Theory at the University of Nottingham, but here in my day job as Vice President Humanities of the British Academy. And so another welcome, this time a welcome on behalf of the Academy to the 2023 British Academy Lecture Series, as we've already heard, being delivered for the first time in partnership with the University of Leicester. And so we would really like to thank the university for hosting this lecture. Many British Academy events take place at our beautiful home in central London, just near Trafalgar Square, which I hope some of you have visited or will have occasion to visit in the future. But we've inaugurated this regional programme, which you've heard about, in recognition of the fact that not everyone finds it easy to get to the capital. And I would say, do also look at our website to find out more about us. Lots of podcasts, some just 10 minutes long. So what is the British Academy? It is the UK's National Academy of the Humanities and Social Sciences. Our strapline is that it mobilises these disciplines to understand the world and shape a brighter future, which is a kind of pun on the acronym SHAPE that we produced for social sciences, humanities, arts, for the people and for the economy/environment, a kind of pendant to STEM, which is the sciences. So we're an independent fellowship of world-leading scholars founded in 1902, so a little younger than our sister organisation, the Royal Society, which was founded in the 1660s. We're also a funding body for research and a forum for debate. And as a forum for debate, our lectures programmes, curated by our fellowship, really aims to stimulate discussion and debate and to reflect the wonderful breadth of our subjects and the academic perspectives within them. So tonight I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our star attraction, Professor John Tolan. But before we do, I'm going to hand over to Professor John Coffey from the University of Leicester to do a proper introduction to our speaker.
Thank you so much, Judith. Yeah, I'll try not to keep you from the star attraction for too long. It's a real honour and pleasure to welcome you and to introduce our distinguished speaker this evening. And I think the turnout is testament to public appetite for history, but also to the importance of this subject that we're going to consider this evening. One of the exciting things about being an historian, and there are exciting things about being an historian, is that the horizons of the field are constantly broadening and new vistas are opening up. And what you'll hear this evening, I think, is one example of that, because over the past generation, there's been an outpouring of new research that explores the interactions and the relations between Jews and Christians and Muslims. And our speaker this evening is a major contributor to that field. John Tolan has studied and taught in universities across North America, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. He's currently Professor of History at the University of Nantes in France. And he's received many prizes and distinctions, including major grants from the European Research Council and the Académie Française. He's the author of numerous scholarly publications, too many to list here, but I'll just give you some highlights of widely acclaimed books, each, I think, with a tantalizing title. Saracens, Islam in the Medieval European Imagination, 2002. Sons of Ishmael, 2008. Saint Francis and the Sultan, The Curious History of a Muslim-Christian Encounter, 2009. And more recently, England's Jews, Finance, Violence, and the Crown in the 13th Century, 2023. And he tells me that Simon de Montfort, of Leicester fame and notoriety, has a prominent place in that. He's also one of the coordinators of the European Research Council's programme, the European Quran, and the author of Faces of Mahomet, Western Perceptions of the Prophet of Islam from the Middle Ages to Today, published in 2019. It's on that subject that John will be speaking to us this evening in a lecture entitled The Enlightenment Prophet, Muhammad in Early Modern Europe. So please do join me in giving a very warm welcome to our speaker, Professor John Tolan.
Let me turn on my microphone. Thank you so much, John, for that introduction, and thank you to the British Academy and to the University of Leicester for the invitation to come speak with you today. Let me move forward past all of these illustrious colleagues to here we are, the Enlightenment prophets, Muhammad in early modern Europe. Now, in 1649, the English Civil War resulted in the establishment of the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell and the execution of King Charles I. In the same year, the first English translation of the Quran was published in London. For some royalists, these two events were linked. They both signified the moral demise of the kingdom. And indeed, some polemicists depicted Cromwell as a new Mahomet or Muhammad, who sought to gain power by attacking the moral and religious foundations of the nation. So I want to look today at how various authors from 17th and 18th century, focusing on England and in France, depicted the Prophet Muhammad, often in order not so much to understand Islam, but in order to carry out polemics against other Christians. And what I'm working on, and this is something, as was mentioned, comes out of work that I published in 2019 in a book called Faces of Muhammad on European depictions of the Prophet of Islam from the 12th century to the 21st. And much of the history of these European depictions of Islam, and particularly of the Prophet, are of course quite negative. It's a story of the history of European Islamophobia. And if I go through in this book some of these very negative images, it's to understand the birth and development of Islamophobia in Europe. But it's not all a story about Islamophobia. It's also, in some cases, a story of Islamophilia, of admiration that various authors express for Islam, or of ambivalence, deep ambivalence, as we'll see in several examples today. Now, starting in 17th century England, I've used the work of Nabil Matar, a Palestinian-American scholar who's worked quite a bit on Islam. His two best-known books, Islam in Britain and Turks, Moors, and Englishmen, explore diplomatic relations between England and the Ottoman Empire, England and Morocco, and also the representation of Islam and of Turks, as Muslims are more often called by European, including English, authors of the 17th century. And culturally, as he shows, the Ottoman world in the 17th century provoked unease for English writers. The Ottoman Empire was a legendary land of wealth, culture, and opulence. The supposedly hedonistic culture of the Turk was denounced by authors who feared its appeal to English men and women, including the appeal for people who never left this island, but who could be enticed into consuming Ottoman wares. Coffee, for example. In 1652, the first coffee house was opened in London. Coffee quickly became popular, and some attributed semi-miraculous properties to the drink. Edward Pocock, whose name I have here, professor of Arabic at Oxford, translated in 1659 an Arabic treatise enumerating the health benefits of coffee. Yet others attacked what they called a Mahometan berry. Coffee, there was an anonymous tract, The Character of a Coffee House, which saw the popularity of the drink as a dark sign of the times, associated with Cromwell's rebellion and the publication of the first English translation of the Quran. As you see in this citation, when coffee once was vended here, the Al-Quran shortly did appear. So the two are linked to this decadence of things Ottoman or Muslim that are supposedly corrupting the English. And so to put this in context, what is the link between the publishing of the Quran and Cromwell's rebellion and the execution of Charles I? Well, it's a chronological accident. Both happened in 1649, but it's made by royalists into an argument of the two signs of English decadence. And here I'm also relying on the work of Matthew Dimmick, who has worked on portrayals of the Prophet Muhammad in early modern English culture. So I've just put a few dates here, which to students of history will be very well known concerning the English Civil War. 1649, of course, Charles I beheaded. This raises question about the role of the church and clergy in England. The royalty, of course, will be restored, but these issues remain subject of debate between conservative clerics and radical Republicans, as well as many in between. So this coincidence of these two events in 1649, the publication of the first translation in English of the Quran and the beheading of Charles I, seems like more than a coincidence to some writers. Now, the translation, which we see here, was not, in fact, made from Arabic into English, but it was made from French into English. In 1647, André de Riez, who is a French diplomat based in Alexandria, had produced a French translation of the Quran directly from Arabic. And it was this translation, French translation, that's 2 years later translated into English anonymously, although many scholars think it may be a scholar named Thomas Ross who did this translation. The authorities, Cromwell's authorities, were not happy about the publication of the Quran. They thought it was a dangerous book that might corrupt readers. So they had the printer, Robert White, arrested and put in jail. They confiscated the copies which he had printed and held a hearing in which eventually he was cleared and released, and the publication of the Quran was allowed. And Thomas Ross, the translator, or we suppose it's him, wrote a preface, the translator to the Christian reader, in which he justified the publication of the Quran, while at the same time implicitly criticizing the Commonwealth authorities who had tried to prevent it. There's no danger, he said, that what he calls a rude and incongruous text, such as the Quran, should seduce Englishmen any more than it has the French, who have had this translation for the last 2 years, he says. Why then would Cromwell and his authorities attempt to prevent the Quran from being published? He can't, of course, criticize them openly, but he gives a fairly clear idea in the passage I've given to you here, what he thinks. He says, Christian reader, though some, conscious of their own instability in religion, and of theirs too like the Turks in this, whose prosperity and opinions they follow, were unwilling this should see the press, yet I am confident, if thou hast been so true a votary to orthodox religion, as to keep thyself untainted of their follies, this shall not hurt thee. So the Cromwellians tried to prevent you, reader, from reading the Quran, but don't worry, you won't be hurt by reading the Quran. And as for those of that batch, referring clearly to Cromwell and his batch, having once abandoned the sun of the gospel, I believe they will wander far into the utter darkness by following strange lights as by this ignis fatuus, feu follet of the Alcoran. Such as it is, I present to thee, having taken the pains only to translate it out of French, not doubting, though it hath been a poison that has infected a very great but most unsound part of the universe, it may provoke an antidote to confirm the health of Christianity. So what is this author saying here? He's presenting the Quran, of course, in a very negative light, as most of the translators of the Quran until the 17th century or until the early 18th century did. They portrayed Muhammad as a false prophet and the Quran as a false revelation. But he says it won't be dangerous for you, Christian reader, to read it. And the reason that these Cromwellian authorities tried to prevent it was because they are unstable in religion. They have abandoned the gospel. So the criticism here, which he, of course, couches in this language without nominally identifying the people he's criticizing. The idea is that these people, Cromwell and his ilk, have abandoned the gospel, have abandoned true religion, have attacked the English church as well as the monarchy. So this is seen throughout his preface to this Quran, and he gives, as many Quranic translators did, he gives a little biography in his introduction of the Prophet Muhammad. Again, as was common, a quite hostile biography in which he tries to present Muhammad as a false prophet. And here in particular, as we'll see, he draws out an implicit comparison between Muhammad and Oliver Cromwell. He's speaking of Muhammad. He says, having drawn to his devotion a numerous though vulgar party of the people, who in his opinion of his prophetical function were prompt to his obedience, he thought it altogether as easy to obtain a kingdom as he had found it not difficult to attain the title of a prophet. And to effect this, having before, under pretense of reformation of religion, gained many followers, while more stood as lookers on, not at all regarding that decoy, he resolved to yoke to it that other concomitant in popular disturbances, liberty, proclaiming it to be the will of God that all men should enjoy it, liberty, and that the edict might first be obeyed in his own family. He enfranchised his slave called Zaidi. So he's saying that Muhammad first pretended to be a prophet, and then he freed his slave, and he's implying, and we know that this Zaidi or Zaid ibn Haritha was indeed a slave that Muhammad had freed. But he's implying that this one act of manumission meant that Muhammad had abolished slavery, which of course historically is not true. But we'll see in the following paragraph, this lets him make the comparison, implicit comparison, to what Cromwell and his followers have done. This bait, as it enhanced his fame, so it added to his retinue. For his multitudes, affecting novelty and a mutation of condition, daily added themselves to his party. So slaves from all parts of Arabia forsook their masters and fled to him, Muhammad, as their redeemer, and embraced his law as a means of their salvation. These, though a fond conceit of his piety, ready to sacrifice their lives at his command, he divided into troops and sent to rob the caravans of merchants that traveled through the deserts. And by this means, having added to his treasure by spoil, and his retinue daily increasing by a multitude of fugitives and vagabonds, who by reason of this liberty, to act any villainy, resorted to him, he at length took up thoughts of employing them in the confirmation of his law, which he knew to be the ready way to his establishment, in that power to which he aspired. So here, and as he goes on, the parallels with Cromwell become clear. He takes one event from Muslim history, the freeing of this slave of Muhammad, and makes it into a general law that Muhammad sort of freed all slaves, and these slaves came to him and attacked the proper aristocratic society, then in a later passage invaded the Byzantine Empire and overthrew the legitimate power there. And all this meant to say, just as Muhammad has done, Cromwell is now doing. So Muhammad is Cromwell, and Cromwell is Muhammad. So this is, again, couched in this language of, he's supposedly, ostensibly writing a biography of Muhammad, and he is, of course, denouncing Islam, but he's also using it to get at an enemy closer to home, the Cromwellians. And of course, in years later, Henry Stubb, so a number of, and Ross was not the only royalist author to make this parallel between Cromwell and Muhammad, Cromwell as a new Muhammad. And finally, some of the Republican writers, such as Henry Stubb, rather than rejecting the comparison, embraced it and presented Muhammad in a very positive light as a reformer who knew how to abolish the powers of and privileges of a corrupt clergy. Here, Henry Stubb wrote his original and progress of Mahometanism, which is a sort of biography of Muhammad and history of the beginnings of Islam. He wrote it in 1671, and he was a Republican. He was a friend and colleague of Thomas Hobbes. He had actually translated the Leviathan of Hobbes into Latin, and he presented the life of Muhammad, and he's working with, he was a student of Edward Pococky, who I mentioned earlier, who had written about coffee, one of the great professors of Arabic at Oxford of the 17th century. And he relies on the recent scholarship of Pococky and other scholars who had depicted Muslim doctrine and devotion in a relatively positive light, trying to be objective, but still had written from a Christian point of view and saw Islam as inferior to Christianity. Not so Stubb. He presents Muhammad as, I said, an extraordinary person with a great soul. He says, far from corrupting Christianity, Muhammad tried to return to its purest expression. And he traces the history of Judaism and Christianity, accenting the doctrinal and institutional fractures within the Christian church and the pagan origins of much of Christian doctrine and rites. He said the titles of the church authorities all come from pagan Rome. Any of the rites of the Christian church, the early Christian church, are adopted from pagan rituals. He said even the idea that Jesus was God and Son of God was something that the first Christians, who were all Jews, didn't believe. They called him Son of God, he says, in an allegorical way because he was a very holy man, but they didn't mean it literally. And he says in this way, Muhammad was correct to reject these doctrines. Muhammad realized that the Christian churches of his day were corrupt, taken over by greedy, grasping clerics and monks, and that Muhammad abolished their privileges. So this was, of course, a radically new version for European Christian writers of the life of Muhammad, who had been, by earlier Christians, almost always portrayed in a negative light, or at least when he was portrayed as positively, he was portrayed as a failed reformer who didn't realize the truth of Christianity. But Stubb goes further than that. He, in this book by Nabil Matar, who gives an edition and commentary of Stubb's text, he calls Stubb, he says that Stubb was responsible for a Copernican revolution in the vision, the European Christian vision of Islam. Now, Stubb's work actually was not published in 1671. He wrote it in 1671, but it only circulated in manuscript. It was impossible to publish this work in Restoration England, and it would have been difficult elsewhere in Europe as well. So it circulated in manuscript, and we know that a number of people, including some of the ones I will be talking about in the coming minutes, have knew and used his work. Now, someone that Stubb studied alongside at Oxford with Pocock was somebody named Humphrey Prideaux, who, on the contrary, wrote a denunciation of what he calls the imposture of the life of Muhammad, in which he tries to show that Muhammad had feigned prophethood, that he produced fake miracles, and that he feigned prophethood. And here we see the frontispiece for a French translation of the text. The text which he published in English he published in English in 1697. It was already translated into French, published in 1699, and published in various other European languages. And he tries to reaffirm the negative traditional vision of Muhammad and the Quran. He says in this passage I've given you here, the whole of this imposture was a thing of extraordinary craft carried on with all the cunning and caution imaginable. The framing of the Al-Quran, wherein lay the main of his cheat, was all contrived at home in as secret a manner as possible, and nothing hazarded abroad but the success of preaching it to the people. And in doing of this, no art or cunning was wanting to make it effectual to the end designed as possible. And therefore, whatever stories are told of this matter that are inconsistent with such a management, we may assure ourselves are nothing else but fables foolishly invented by some zealous Christians to blast the imposture, which needed no such means for its confutation. Now, what he's referring to here, there are all sorts of hostile medieval Christian legends of the Prophet Muhammad making fake miracles to trick his flock into following him. But he says there was no need for this. So Prideaux I've mentioned because he reaffirms this traditional rejection of Islam. So we don't have, it's not a steady progression of from hostile to more and more tolerant. There's a real debate among European scholars about Islam and the relations of Islam to Christianity. And this debate often hides debates about, or barely hides, I would say, debates about the proper relations within European Christian society between the kings and the church, between the people and the church. Now, one of the scholars who writes about this is a man named John Tolan, no relation to me, who wrote in 1718 his Nazarenus, or Jewish, Gentile, and Mohammedan Christianity. Now, he had come across a manuscript in Italian of something called the Gospel of Barnabas. Now, Barnabas is one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, and this text purports to be the gospel that he wrote. And he comes across this text, and it's very surprising because the gospel corresponds to what he says Mahomet had understood as the gospel of Jesus. So he says this is the first original gospel that he's refound. And in fact, recent scholarship have shown that this text, which only is extant from the late 16th, early 17th century, and only in Spanish and Italian versions, was probably written by Moriscos, in other words, Spanish Muslims who had been forcibly converted to Christianity. And it was written as defense of Islam to show how Christianity and Islam actually converged spiritually. And in this gospel, Jesus is, among other things, predicting the coming of a new, greater prophet, Muhammad. But Tolan sees this, and whether he really thinks this or not, he presents this as the true gospel, and which shows that much of the doctrine presented by the Christian church is false, and that Muhammad was a great reformer, and he had a clearer understanding of the gospel, of the real teaching of Jesus, than most Christians of Tolan's day, be they Protestant or Catholic. And so it seems quite likely that John Toland had seen and read Henry Stubbs' work in manuscript. But he gives a new positive assessment of Muhammad and of the Quran we see really for the first time in print. As I said, Henry Stubbs' book didn't get printed until much later. But here in John Toland's Nazarenus, we see this very positive presentation of Muhammad in the Quran. And he sees just in a few quotes that I've given you here, he affirms you'll discover some of the fundamental doctrines of Mahometanism. Now, Mahometanism is the word that many European writers of the time, Mahometanism or Mohammedanism, used to designate Islam. The fundamental doctrines of Mahometanism, he says, to have their rise not from Sergius, the Nestorian monk, because this Sergius, the Nestorian monk, was a character from medieval polemics based on Muslim tradition. There was a Muslim tradition. There was a Christian monk named Bahira who had encountered the young Muhammad before his prophetic calling and said, this man is a prophet that's been announced in the Gospels. And so the Muslim story of Bahira was a way of showing that good Christians, like good Jews, had expected Muhammad and had been waiting for him. And this then, the story of Bahira, is twisted by hostile Christian writers to make Bahira a bad Christian and heretical Christian who taught Muhammad what he knew about Christian history, about Jewish history, and that corrupted him. And so this Bahira becomes Sergius, a Nestorian monk, Nestorian meaning a Christian who did not have the proper Christology from the point of view of European Catholics or Protestants for that matter. So a heretical monk who corrupted Muhammad and who taught him this doctrine. So he says, Muhammad's fundamental doctrines did not come from Sergius, a person who has hitherto served for world-defined purposes, but from the earliest monuments of Christian religion. In other words, Muhammad was closer to true Christianity than are Christians today. The Mahometans, he says, may not improperly be reckoned and called a sort or sect of Christians. They might, with as much reason and safety, be tolerated at London and Amsterdam as the Christians of every kind are so at Constantinople and throughout all Turkey. Now, he was one of a number of 17th and 18th century writers who emphasized the fact that Christians could live in the Ottoman Empire and practiced their religion. And while Christians within Europe were fighting between Protestants and Catholics and killing each other, whereas it's much safer and more peaceful to be a Christian in the Muslim Ottoman Empire. So this is another idea that he brings across. And finally, he said the Mahometans might be as well allowed mosques in these parts of Europe, if they desire it, than any other sectaries. So John Tolan is arguing, of course, these are very radical arguments for an Englishman, and he was well read also. His work was translated into French. It was radical critique of the relations between the English crown and the Anglican Church, or between the French crown and the Catholic Church, and you could make the same argument for other European monarchs. And clearly, his real interest in that polemics, and he's sort of masking his polemical arguments in a work which he tries to present as purely scholarly. He says, I found this manuscript, and this is what Christianity should be, and Muhammad was right about it. So obviously a very radical reassessment. So others, writers of this time also gave radical reassessments of Islam. We see this in the Traité des Trois Imposteurs, the treatise of the three impostors, an anonymous text first published in 1719 in French and subsequently translated into various languages. And the author, anonymous author, lambasts, he starts by lambasting the priests and rulers of ancient Greece and Rome who took advantage of the credulity of their people to grab power and give their power a sacred aura and extract riches from their people. But he says, this is what religious leaders do. And he says the worst of these leaders are the three impostors, great impostors, which for him are Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. He says that Moses was a magician trained in Egypt who fell out of favor with the Pharaoh and fled Egypt after committing several murders. Moses then plotted revenge against the Pharaoh and through a series of stunts and magical tricks convinced the ignorant Hebrews to rebel against their Egyptian masters and to follow him through the desert. He was an absolute despot, he says, a trickster and impostor. And Moses' final trick cost him his life. He threw himself off a high precipice in the desert so that his body might never be found and that people would think he had been spirited off to heaven. Jesus Christ was no better, he says. He, quote, got himself followed by some imbeciles whom he persuaded that the Holy Spirit was his father and his mother a virgin, unquote. The author expresses admiration for Jesus' skill in hoodwinking the people through bogus miracles and for his cleverness in arguing with the Pharisees. Quote, one can judge from all that we have said that Christianity, like all other religions, is no more than a crudely woven imposture whose success and progress would astonish even its inventors if they came back to the world. So we saw that for traditionalists like Humphrey Prideaux, it was Muhammad who was the impostor. But here, even Moses and Jesus are impostors. And of course, for this author, Muhammad is no better. He describes Muhammad tricking his people through bogus miracles and false revelations, and concludes, as we see here, Muhammad raised himself up and was happier than Jesus insofar as he saw before his death the progress of his law, which the son of Mary was not able to do because of his poverty. He was even happier than Moses, who by an excess of ambition cast himself down a precipice to finish his days. Mahomet died in peace, and with all his wishes gratified, he had moreover some certainty that his doctrine would subsist after his death, having accommodated it to the genius of his sectaries, born and raised in ignorance, which an abler man might perhaps not have been able to do. So this anonymous author sketches a portrait of an impostor similar to the portraits of Muhammad that we find among other European authors from the 12th century on. But what's new here, of course, is that he has applied the same status of impostor, the same portrait, polemical portrait, to Jesus and Moses, which, of course, no Christian author would do. So we see the variety of ways in which the figure of Muhammad can be used by people who are debating about the proper relations, the proper role of religion in European society, the proper relations between religious authorities and clerical and lay authorities. And depending on what one's strategy, one can portray Muhammad either as a scoundrel, an impostor, or as, on the contrary, a great inspired reformer who abolished the privileges of the clergy. Now, looking at, and as John had mentioned, I'm now working on a project on the history of the Quran in Europe, and one of the one of the fundamental milestones in the study of the Quran in Europe was the work of Ludovico Maracci, who had the Quran, published a translation of the Quran, an Arabic text of the Quran with a Latin translation in Padova in 1698, and with extensive commentary and what he calls refutations, because he's a Catholic missionary, had been the confessor to Innocent XI, Pope Innocent XI, and Maracci was a formidable scholar. We know also that he had a team of Maronite Christians working with him in Rome, helping him with his Arabic, and helping write the text. So he's, at the one hand, it's a work of great erudition. On the other hand, it's very much a traditional Catholic point of view of Islam, where he's trying to disprove the Quran and use his text is meant to be used by Catholic missionaries to try to convert Muslims. This provoked reactions by a number of European scholars on Islam. Briefly, Adrien Roland, who we see here, who wrote in 1705 his two books on the Mohammedan religion. The first of these two books, an Arabic treatise, is in Arabic, a treatise in the short system of the Mohammedan theology. It's sort of a resume of Muslim doctrine, which he publishes in Arabic and with a Latin translation. It presents from a Muslim point of view the 5 pillars of Islam and basic Muslim doctrines concerning the unity of God, angels, scriptures, prophets, and the last days. And the second book is his own exposition, refutation of what he presents as 39 erroneous beliefs that Europeans have about Islam. So he's really trying to present in an objective way, what is Islam from a Muslim point of view, and how do you have Europeans misunderstood Islam? So he's quite specifically arguing against Maracci and his point of view. And we see just briefly, he's got this genealogy of the family of the Prophet. He has a little diagram of Mecca to explain the rites of the Hajj or pilgrimage. So we are moving here towards a science of religion where Islam doesn't necessarily have to be always compared to Christianity, but scholars can make an effort to understand it in its own right. Now let me move to another Life of Muhammad written by Henri Comte de Bounavier, published in 1731, the year after his death. And Bounavier presents the prophet as a divinely inspired messenger. He's got an image very similar to what we've seen in John Tolan and before him Stubb. Muhammad is a divinely inspired messenger whom God used to confound the bickering Oriental Christians, to liberate the Orient from the despotic rule of the Romans and the Persians, and to spread the knowledge of the unity of God from India to Spain. So, and he argues that it doesn't make sense to say that Muhammad was hostile to God. He says, since if the fortune of this personage was not the effect of natural means, the success could only be from God, whom the impious will accuse of having led half the world into error and destroyed violently his own revelation. In other words, why, if God is hostile to Islam, why would he let it flourish? Clearly, he favored Muhammad. So he argues against Prideaux, whom he cites extensively. He scoffs at the hostile Christian legends concerning Muhammad's Christian sidekick Sergius. He denies that Muhammad was an impostor or that Muslim doctrine is irrational. On the contrary, he says, the prophet rejected all that was irrational and undesirable in Christianity. Has found it, the cult of the relic, the power of priests and monks. And this is what he has to say about how Muhammad viewed Christianity of his day. He said, Mahomet, as he writes it, regarded the bishops, priests, and secular clergy chiefly as a political combination of men united for the purpose of making religion subservient to their passions. This sounds very much like the point of view of the author of the Three Impostors, except it's not, of course, the founders of the religion that are blamed here, but the priests. The religion becomes, for them, subservient to their passions, their concupiscence, avarice, pride, and dominion, and who had the secret of persuading the people that an implicit obedience to them was inseparable from what was due to God. Moreover, he looked upon them as the real authors of an infinite number of disputes, which then divided the professors of Christianity and the inventors, still talking about the clergy, of the superstitions of those times. In short, as false teachers who had labored to plunge all men into error according to their several conditions, ranks, and degrees of capacity. So what does Muhammad do? He abolishes the power of the clergy, Boulainvier says, and he reinstates a direct relation between the worshiper and God. No intermediaries necessary. Now, you read this passage, he's writing in French in 1731. You'll see, as I've noted, the book is published in London and in Amsterdam, not in Paris. Why now? You couldn't publish that in 18th century Paris. It's clearly a critique, barely veiled critique of the power of the Catholic Church in France and the relationship between the crown and the church. So Boulainvier puts his own criticisms into the mouth of Muhammad. The clergy, lusting after power, riches, and glory, concocts ways to make the people follow them, whereas Muhammad is an impostor. Muhammad is not an impostor. Muhammad is a reformer who abolishes their power. Now, let me move forward to Voltaire. Voltaire, who is a fascinating character because he has several works in which he's interested in Islam and particularly Muhammad, and comes out with quite different portrayals of Muhammad. So he wrote this famous play, Le Fanatisme, ou Mahomet le Prophète, where Muhammad, as the title indicates, becomes an archetype of fanaticism. And I won't narrate the plot of this play, but Muhammad is a scoundrel who pretends to be a prophet in order to obtain what he wants, which is power over the city of Mecca and beautiful women. And so it's a very hostile portrayal, but in several letters to his to colleagues and friends, he said, well, I presented this as Muhammad because I knew that if I had directly attacked Catholic fanaticism, I would have been censored, the play wouldn't have been put on. But my real target were Catholic fanatics. So it may seem a strange way to do that, but he then later changed his attitudes, or at least his strategy towards Islam. And we see this in part because he came across the Quran, a new translation of the Quran by George Sale. Now, George Sale is somebody we know very little about, but he produced the second English translation, but this time it's not from the French, it's directly from the Arabic of the Quran. And this is a very different translation from all the ones that have preceded it, because as I said, all of the translators from the earliest ones in the 12th century to Marachi in 1698 had presented the Quran as a false scripture, Muhammad as a false prophet, but not George Sale. He, on the contrary, he's read a lot of the authors I've cited. He's read John Tolan, he's read Boulainvier, and he has a presentation that's very similar to them. He presents, he has a preliminary discourse, and in other words, an introduction, which he again gives a biography of Muhammad, history of early Islam, and he, like other authors we've examined so far, presents Muhammad as a reformer who established a new, purer form of monotheism than was prevalent in Christianity of his day. And Voltaire himself came across, Voltaire had spent time in London. He came across this translation of the Quran. And I won't read you these letters, but as you can see, he wrote to several of his friends saying, look, I've come across this new translation of the Quran. And he was quite fascinated and impressed by Sale's work. So he then comes across, he presents a quite different vision of Islam and of Muhammad in 1757 when he writes his Essai sur les mœurs et l'esprit des nations, which is sort of his attempt to write universal history. An important attempt because universal history before in Europe had been written from a Christian point of view. It was basically a combination of the history of Rome, the history of the church, and with a little bit of biblical history. Whereas Voltaire wanted to go beyond this, so he's got chapters on China, on India, and on Islam. And here he presents Muhammad in a much more positive light. He's read Sale, he's read Boulainvier, and he says of Muhammad, as we see here, as a conqueror, legislator, monarch, and pontiff, he, Muhammad, played the greatest role that can be played on earth in the eyes of the common people. But the wise will always prefer Confucius, precisely because he was none of these things, and because he was content to teach the purest morality to a more ancient, more populated, and more polite nation than the Arab nation. So he has this ambivalence. He compares Muhammad to Confucius, says, well, Confucius was better, but Muhammad knew how to preach to his people, the Arabs. And as Ziad al-Marsafi said in this wonderful book that I put here, The Enlightenment Quran, Voltaire, in his later writings, almost came to identify with Muhammad. He compares himself in interesting ways to Muhammad. They both were rejected by their homelands, and both then used writing to try to pass a universal message. And Ziad al-Marsafi concludes that Muhammad, that Voltaire sort of identified himself with Muhammad. He describes Muhammad also, he compares Muhammad with Cromwell. Both were revolutionaries, but Muhammad achieved far greater things because his revolution changed the history for millions of people over centuries. He compares to Alexander the Great, to Moses, and he comes out as superior to all these people. So Muhammad, again, he's more ambivalent than somebody like Boulainvier or Henry Stubb, but Muhammad is presented in a largely positive light. Let me move on then to another writer, Emmanuel Pastore, who in 1787 published Zoroastre, Confucius, et Mahomet. Zoroaster, Confucius, and Muhammad is one of these wonderful long 18th century titles, and he says they're compared as sectaries, legislators, and moralists. So what Pastore is interested in, here this is published in 1787, just 2 years before the French Revolution, and he's a jurist, a historian of law, who is interested in looking at, and again, European legal tradition had been focused on Roman law and church law. And he says, well, we have to look at other civilizations to see how they ordered their societies and how their great legislators thought. So he looks to Zoroaster in Persia, Confucius in China, and Muhammad among the Arabs, who he describes as great men, the greatest legislators of the universe, he says. And he narrates their lives and compares their careers as religious reformers and lawgivers. He defends the prophet, he says, too often calumniated as an impostor. In fact, the Quran, he says, proffers the most sublime truths of cult and morals. It defines the unity of God with an admirable concision. The common accusations of the prophet's immorality are unfounded, he said. On the contrary, his law enjoins sobriety, generosity, and compassion, on his followers. The legislator of Arabia, he says, was a great man. So the idea of Muhammad as legislator to the Arabs is something that we find with Pastoret, and then we'll find it later on among subsequent authors. We find it, among other things, in Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon had read a number of the books that I've mentioned, and he's the last example I want to look at this evening. Gibbon had read Voltaire, he had read Boulainvilliers. He was somewhat critical of them, but fascinated by their perceptions. He had read Sale's translation of the Quran. And he opens up, so this is his great history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, which, of course, the Roman Empire we think of as falling in the 5th century when Rome is overrun by barbarians. But in fact, the Roman Empire survives as what we call the Byzantine Empire until 1453. So his history of the decline and fall of Roman Empire goes up into 1453, and he has a considerable amount of the later parts of the book deal with Islam and the relations between Islam and the Roman or Byzantine Empire. So he's got a whole chapter devoted to Muhammad and the beginnings of Islam, in which he's using many of the authors that I've talked about. And in his portrayal of the Prophet Muhammad, he echoes the Enlightenment view of 17th century Christianity as a degenerate faith that needed a radical reformer. And he says in his assessment of the Prophet, he says, conversation enriches the understanding, but solitude is the school of genius. And the uniformity of a work denotes the hand of a single artist. From his earliest youth, Muhammad was addicted to religious contemplation. Each year during the month of Ramadan, he withdrew from the world and from the arms of Khadijah, his wife. In the cave of Hira, 3 miles from Mecca, he consulted the spirit of fraud or enthusiasm. Note that fraud or enthusiasm. He doesn't take position on whether this is fraudulent or not. The spirit of fraud or enthusiasm, whose abode is not in the heavens, but in the mind of the prophet. That faith, the faith which, under the name of Islam, he preached to his family and nation, is compounded of an eternal truth and a necessary fiction, that there is only one God and that Muhammad is the apostle of God. So Gibbon, as a Christian, rejects that Muhammad is apostle of God, but he comes down in the later passages of his work to say that Muhammad was an enthusiast, that he believed in his mission, and that he carried it out with skill, with admirable skill. So he's got this ambivalent but largely positive Enlightenment view of the prophet. So what I hope I've shown this evening is that Muhammad, in his, according to these various European authors interest them not just because they're interested in Islam, but he's, as Ziad al-Marsafi, who I cited earlier, said, Islam is interesting because Islam is good to think with. These European authors are obsessed with problems closer to home. This is before the age of European empire in the Islamic world. This is in the 18th century. British Raj doesn't exist yet, although British are obviously present in India. In the 18th century, the French have not yet established an empire in the Muslim world before Napoleon goes to Egypt in 1798. So we're not looking at Orientalism that justifies colonial empire, not yet. What we're seeing is visions of the prophet that are used to try to think about different ways we could organize our societies in Europe, in particular different ways that we can give a role to religion. So often the positive portrayals of Muhammad are no more accurate than some of the negative ones. They are used, the positive and the negative ones are often used more against other rivals within European society to argue about issues closer to home, whether it's between Protestants and Catholics starting in the 16th century, or whether, as we've seen, it's between freethinkers and traditionalists about what the role of church should be in European society. So these are a few examples that I've given you tonight of the faces of Muhammad, the ways in which European writers portray the Prophet Islam over the centuries. So thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, John, for a wonderfully rich and wide-ranging talk. You've taken us from the era of the English Civil War through to the American Revolution, and I'm sure people will have plenty of questions. So just before we start, we've got about 10-15 minutes. If you have a question, do raise your hand. We've also got roving mics, so I've got a couple of very helpful student volunteers here to take mics around. It'd be great as well if you keep your question nice and succinct, because we don't have too long, so it'd be good to go through a number of questions and hear from a number of different people. So do please try and ask a question and not give a speech. Who wants to start? Yeah, right at the back there, on the back. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, John. Great lecture. The question from me is, how far did the writers you're considering, how far were their views and opinions actually impacted by interactions with real Muslims?
Very little, in fact. Most of the authors I've talked about probably never met a Muslim. Which is, this changes in the age of empire. And, it's very different from, earlier in the 16th century, there were, of course, in medieval Spain, there was, of course, a lot of contact between Muslims and Christians. So there, most of the Christians who wrote about Islam knew Muslims and had some awareness of Muslim text and doctrine. But here, it's this Enlightenment Islam that imagines Islam as this sort of pure monotheism. And Gibbon even says, I didn't cite the passage, but he says at one point that the doctrine of Islam is very close to what a philosophical deist might profess. And of course, Gibbon has no idea of how Islam is actually practiced in the 18th century Muslim world. And one of the things I talk in a later chapter of this book about Napoleon, and Napoleon is very much seduced by this idea of Islam as a rational religion. He says he goes to Egypt with the Quran under his arm, and tries to convince the Egyptian that he's a friend of Islam. And he's got this idea of Islam as this pure rational monotheism. And so he and the French administration don't know what to do with Sufis, they don't know what to do with the saints' tombs and so forth. None of that fits their idea that they have of Islam from reading books like this. So there are a few. Nabil Matar has worked on Muslim travelers in early modern Europe. So there are a few encounters. Someone like Antoine Gallon, who did the French translation of the 1001 Nights. There was, now I've forgotten his name, I think a Lebanese traveler who had come through and spent some time in Paris. So there were a few people starting in the 18th century who did travel and even earlier, but most of the authors I dealt with have almost no direct connection with Islam or Muslims.
Thank you, John. The questions. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, and then Haroon. Yeah.
Hello. My personal view is that, you can't learn to swim from a book. So that's my personal view. I'm going to ask you your personal view because, can you be a Muslim from the Quran? Can you be a Christian from the Bible? Can you learn to swim from a book? Same kind of thing. But you're looking at it as if it's propaganda. Propagandists looking at these books and Muhammad as propagandists.
Mm-hmm.
I just wondered what your own personal view was on that.
Well, my view is that it is. Much of what I presented is propaganda. As you're right, you can't. These people think that the Quran. They've got these translations of the Quran into Latin and into other languages, and they think we can read the Quran. We're going to understand what Islam is. But as you say, reading the Quran, you understand an important part of the basis of Islam, but you certainly don't understand it all. Just as someone reading the Bible couldn't, guess at what a Christian church service would be. One of the things and I've got this new project on the Quran and European culture, and a lot of the European readers of the Quran come to the Quran as a book, a holy book like the Bible. This is the Muslim Bible, which is not completely false, of course, but it misses the whole orality. When you go, if you're in Muslim countries, you're hearing the Quran continuously, and the Quran is an oral text as much as it is a written text. Both components. And of course, this is true to a certain extent of some biblical texts. The Psalms were sung by medieval monks and so forth, but it's particularly true of Islam, of the Quran in Islam. So as you say, you can't learn to swim, or you can't learn what Islam is by just reading the Quran. But some of these people thought, they had bookish knowledge of Islam, and they thought they understood what it was.
Thanks for a really fascinating lecture. My question is based for the authors like Henry Stubb, for example. What kind of sources were they working with in terms of sourcing the knowledge about the life of Muhammad? So you mentioned, for example, European colonialism comes later, and that's really when we see the manuscripts of prophetic biography. So for someone like Stubb, where was he getting his information? Do we know?
Yeah, and Nabil Matar has worked on that. Stubb didn't read Arabic, so he can't read any Arabic sources. But there were some works translated into Latin by his professor Edward Parcock, among others, by, Adrien Roland was later, but by other scholars in France and in other parts of Europe. So there were, starting in the 17th century, there were important books about the history of Islam that were being translated from Arabic mostly into Latin, which was still the dominant scholarly language, and then increasingly into French and English and other languages.
Thank you for that very fascinating lecture. My question is this. So you spoke about there's a lot of nuance in scholars' perceptions of the Prophet, whether that be negative or that be positive. I wonder how much did that affect attitudes to the Prophet in kind of the general population, or was that just something that just kind of stayed amongst scholarly circles, or was there some kind of an impact beyond that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's very hard to say because, of course, what we have are the texts. But sometimes some elements of this come up in unexpected places. Now, there was a legend, one of the legends I talk about that comes from the Middle Ages was, as I said, there were fake miracles attributed to Muhammad. One of them was that there's a story that after Muhammad died, he was put in a casket that was made out of iron, and he was put in a temple in Mecca, and the temple had magnets in the ceiling so that his tomb floated in the air. And this was a fake miracle, that made these Muslims think that he was, this was a sign of God's favor when it's just magnetism. So there's a very strange legend. As I tell my students, this is medieval fake news. You try to explain away the successes of Islam by saying, oh yeah, they did all these fake miracles. That's why these people think this stuff. Gibbon mentions this legend to say that this is ridiculous. He says, first of all, Muhammad's tomb is in Medina and not in Mecca, and secondly, it's on the ground and not floating in the air. But sometimes you come across things in strange places. There's Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote, one of the early feminist writers in the, I think, late 18th century, if I'm remembering right. She wrote this book on the rights of women, a passionate argument for equal rights for women. And she said, at one point she writes, the fate of women in our society is suspended in the air like the vulgar tale of Muhammad's coffin, which I found fascinating because here is somebody who isn't particularly interested in Islam, but she's citing this legend clearly in a way that makes it think that it was well known. She cites it as a vulgar legend. Clearly she doesn't believe it, but it's a metaphor that she knows she can use with her readers because everybody knows the story. So that was something. When I came across that, I was fascinated because it's only with little mentions like that you have an idea of how diffused these ideas were. Because of course we don't have a whole lot of text from that allow us to know what general public is thinking about these things.
Okay, we've got time for a couple of final questions. So I think maybe take these together. So yeah, one there. Anyone else? Yeah, and David, yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask your opinion about the political influences in terms of, so if these were, some of these views were based on propaganda, was it a matter of political rivalry between the Ottoman Empire and some other European powers at that time, or was it Spanish political influences in that? And do you feel any resemblance in any propaganda nowadays? Is there an element of that in your opinion?
Yes, well, clearly the Ottoman Empire was, in the early part of our period in the 17th century, whether in England or in other parts of Europe, the Ottoman Empire inspired very mixed feelings, both of admiration and fascination, but also fear. And there was obviously legitimate fear of the Ottoman troops who were advancing into the heart of Europe. 1683 was the Second Siege of Vienna, and it was after the failure of the Second Siege of Vienna that the Habsburg in particular, and then the Russians started to conquer parts of the Ottoman Empire. So by the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire doesn't inspire the fear that it had earlier. But to the second part of your question, are there parallels? Well, clearly they are, and some of the Islamophobic legends that really started in the Middle Ages and that I traced through the centuries, some of them, the same tropes keep coming up. The idea of the prophet as a bogus prophet, the idea of denouncing his violence and so forth, is something that we find. There's Ketcha Ali, who's a scholar at Boston University, has written a fascinating book about biographies of Muhammad in the 19th and 20th centuries, where she looks at both Muslim and non-Muslim biographies written in English, French, Urdu, and Arabic, and how many of, at first Western, until the 19th century, Western and Islamic traditions about the Prophet are very separate. But starting in the 19th century, they're responding to each other in interesting ways.
Thank you. One last question.
Thank you. Thank you for a great lecture. So I was thinking about George Sale's relationship with the SPCK.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering whether you could say a little bit more about, first of all, to what extent George Sale goes rogue, or to what extent he's working under the auspices of the SPCK to kind of engender a conversion.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, if you could say a little bit more about how Christian mission feeds into your story.
Yeah. Yeah, the SPCK, for those who don't know, is an organization of Christian missionaries, and he participated, I think, and I'm saying this from memory, but I think he participated in the Arabic translation of the Gospels. So, as I said, we know little about Sale. We know that he had been associated with them, but his translation of the Quran doesn't seem to be in any way, or at least hasn't been shown to be part of a project under their auspices. And we know he also participated in a universal history in which he wrote some of the passages on the history of Islam. So yeah, I'm afraid I don't know much, and I don't know what evidence there is that would help answer that question.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you so much, everyone, for the range of your questions as well. I'm sure you'll agree it's been a tremendous lecture. You've taken us all the way from Cromwell through to Gibbon, but I think you've also introduced us to heretical monks and missionaries and clandestine manuscripts and coffee houses and even a diagram of Mecca, plays, genealogies. And I think one thing that really came across to me is, alongside all the stereotyping and the stigmatization, there's also something kind of more interesting going on in terms of European engagement with Islam. And actually that engagement and reappraisal is a key feature of this really, really formative moment in European history of the European Enlightenment. So you've given us a huge amount to think about. Unfortunately, you've written a book, so we can kind of go and follow that up. But I do invite everybody to join with me and thank our speaker, Professor John Tolan.